What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Return of the Maker in the Ultimate Universe. Okay, so there's a couple things that we have to flesh out before we officially kickstart this video. And the first thing to really establish here is what's been happening up until this point, which is not overly complex, but I think it does bear some measure of importance when it comes to establishing what's happening here. So, as most of you guys probably know, Earth 6160 was just an alternate reality at one point in time, very similar to the main Marvel Universe, Earth 616, when the Maker was trying to recreate the original Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610. So basically ignore any appearances of Earth 1610 after the events of Secret Wars 2015. When the Maker was trying to recreate that alternate reality, he realized it really just couldn't be done in the sense of bringing that alternate reality back. And so he traveled to 6160 and then just started reworking that reality to essentially make it into his own image, which involved jumping through the time stream and making all kinds of changes. And so by the time you picked up with Ultimate Invasion, when the Maker had basically started altering things, we got these small moments that turned out to be significant. For example, Peter Parker was never bitten by the radioactive spider. Instead, he just went on to be normal Peter Parker. And ultimately, the entire Ultimate Invasion storyline just kind of boiled down to Kang the Conqueror from the future, traveling back to the present day, fighting the Maker in order to try to alter or change what it was the Maker had done to the timeline, and then Howard Stark, the father of Tony, was essentially caught in the middle of it all, with him being Iron Man. And so at the end of Ultimate Invasion, when the Maker was defeated, and Kang the Conqueror was defeated, and Howard Stark was basically, again, kind of caught in the middle, they were all stuck inside the city, right? The dome out in Latveria. We don't know whatever actually happened to Victor Von Doom. All we know in the Ultimate Universe, as it exists now, is that Reed Richards was taken by the Maker in this reality and turned into Dr. Doom. A pretty tragic story. There's always a playlist down in the description and at the end of the video if you want to get caught up on everything. What matters is this story represents the return of the Maker, which is to say the 2-year window is over, the dome is opening up, the Maker is coming back. And so what this does here is this opens up with the Savage Land, basically this kind of a jungle paradise down below the city of New York, and we're told that there are 3 new uprisings that are happening today. Now, this is a conversation between Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson, alongside J. Jonah Jameson and Uncle Ben. And one of the things that they say here, right, Uncle Ben says 3 in one day, a small town in West Virginia, another in Massachusetts, and my God, they're saying the city of Detroit. And that's where Jonah asks, is that verified? And that's where Uncle Ben says a large organized force of workers has overthrown and imprisoned the local police, occupied government facilities, and declared allegiance to the Ultimates. The Altnet is euphoric. And so J. Jonah Jameson points out here, photos and videos can be faked, and this phantom reporter is not an impartial source. We have to confirm. Now, we don't know who the phantom reporter is, and it's entirely possible that it's Eddie Brock. But again, we don't know the definitive answer to that question. Instead, Tony Stark appears here, right, as Iron Lad, and he says, I assure you, the information that you're getting is accurate. He says, I am there with them now. Detroit has officially joined the Ultimates. And that's where Jameson says, we'll quote you on that, Stark, but Ben, call your guy in Royal Oak. Now, here's the thing to know about the idea that Tony Stark is everywhere. One of the things that we had seen previously was that Tony Stark and the other members of the Ultimates had been lured into a trap by the Incredible Hulk and his immortal weapons, because in this Ultimate Universe, the Incredible Hulk is a bad guy who has the power of the Iron Fist. And one of the things that had happened is that Tony Stark had seemingly been killed, only for Tony to effectively create duplicates of himself, which allows him to be in multiple places at one time. But one of the other things that had gone on here is that in order to win the war against the Maker, to basically start this conflict by overthrowing the Illuminati, so the Incredible Hulk and the rest of the Maker's inner council, Tony Stark realized that they had to think bigger. So in a lot of ways, it is Dennis Camp kind of taking a page out of Jonathan Hickman and Nick Spencer's Avengers world, right? Like bringing the world together under the banner of the Avengers in the main Marvel universe. With the Ultimates, it was the same way. Everybody is an Ultimate, right? Whether you're just a UPS driver or you're a person with powers, you have the ability to stand against the status quo. And so on some level, you have the responsibility to do that. And so that's where Tony Stark addresses Peter directly and says, it's time. And so that's where he actually ends up taking the symbiote Picotech suit away from Richard Parker, the son of Peter, and giving it back to Peter himself. Now, this is inevitably going to be a controversial thing, I think, for a lot of Ultimate Spider-Man fans, because the idea of Richard getting the suit that was originally given to Peter, but that Peter had given to Richard, kind of helped to define Richard over the course of Jonathan Hickman's run on Ultimate Spider-Man. And so the fact that all that is done away, like that, right in the blink of an eye, may rub some people the wrong way. I mean, you could argue that it was the inevitable outcome of all of this. It all kind of started with Peter. It's all going to circle back to Peter. It was only a matter of time before the suit went back to him again. But regardless of how you see it, the suit does return to Peter. And that's when Peter says his goodbyes to his family, and he tells them, everything's going to be fine. I will return. I promise I'm going to be back. And so when Tony Stark and Peter teleport to Latveria, where the city of the Maker is opening up, the first question out of Peter's mouth, we're going to die, aren't we? And that's where Tony just says, like Doom says, it is a statistical certainty. And Peter just says, that's what I figured. It was a smart move, right? Peter says, thank you for that back there, right? Both of you. Because the reality is that the symbiote does have a mind of its own, despite the fact that it's technological and not a piece of the living abyss, as we know in the main Marvel universe. But both the symbiote chose to leave Richard, and of course, Tony basically made it do it at the same time. But what was so important there, and the reason why Peter's thanking Tony, is because Tony essentially yanked him away. And by effectively being pulled away from his family, it makes it easier for Peter to leave. Because the longer that Peter stayed there, the harder it was going to be to walk away. Because Peter understood he may very well die here. And how do you walk away from living a life with your family knowing you're going to die, right? It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And so that's where you kind of switch over to the idea that America Chavez and Dr. Doom are with them as well. That America Chavez kind of prefers to refer to everything as like a rescue mission as opposed to like a suicide run, but like that's really what it is. And so that's where the question's asked, right? Is there really even a plan? Because Peter's kind of been left out of this. It's one of the important things to understand about the current Ultimate Universe in Marvel is that yes, Peter Parker is a part of it, but he's always just kind of been over there in New York, dealing with his rogues gallery, Kingpin, Mr. Negative, and so on. He hasn't really been part of like the bigger picture involving everything that's been happening with the Ultimates. And so that's where Tony fills him in. And he says, Doom and I have spent relative years developing a way to take control of the city. Once the dome comes down, we will turn the city against the Maker and his children of tomorrow. And so that's where Peter just says, okay, but like, where are all the bad guys? Like, shouldn't they be here trying to stop us? And that's where he's told the members of the council who still live hide in underground bunkers and distant dimensions as far away from ground zero as possible. And that terrifies Peter, because Peter's thought here is, okay, so the council have effectively just been stewards, right? Keeping an eye on the kingdom while the king is away. And that in his mind, if the idea here is that they're truly that loyal to the Maker, you would think they'd be like the first line of defense, if for nothing out of just pure zealotry, the fact that they believe in the Maker so vehemently. So there's only one of two options here. Either the council doesn't really believe in the Maker, which flies in the face of everything that they've been doing, or, as Peter puts it here, the Maker's own men don't think they'll survive the city opening. And you guys don't find that concerning, because that's one of the things to know. We don't know what's been going on inside of there. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But Peter asks, right, why aren't there more of us here? Where are the Ultimates? And that's where Tony says everywhere, right? Following the message I broadcast last month, the uprising has rapidly spread across the globe. New fronts open up every day. I am currently in 23 places at once in various capacities. In shielded asynchronous orbit, I helped She-Hulk coordinate a movement with over 3 million active members and growing. He says, in the East, I am with Captain America and Hawkeye leading irregular forces against Captain Britain and his otherworld reinforced Imperial Army. Giants crush entire protest movements under their gargantuan heels, while Techno-Merlins see our strategies in tea leaves and entrails of goats before we even think them up. Because that's one of the things to keep in mind about the Ultimate Universe, is that because this new Ultimate Universe is not like the original 1610, it's almost kind of a blend between the original 1610 and the main Marvel Universe as we know it now, which is to say, in the original 1610, it was an answer to the question, what would it look like if superheroes existed in the world that we live in now, right? There's obviously not much in the way of like crazy magic or anything like that, right? I don't know. All the Avengers use iPhones, right? Who knows? But in the main Marvel Universe, it's just kind of flights of fantasy, right? All kinds of crazy stuff. stuff, like the Omniversal Magistrates or TechNet and different things like that, like cosmic entities and whatnot. It's bonkers when you sit down and you think about it. And so the current Ultimate Universe being a blend between the two, we haven't really seen Otherworld, but for the most part, we know it exists. And within Otherworld, traditionally in Marvel Comics, that's the home of Arthurian legend, right? King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, Roma, all that kind of stuff. Mad Jim Jaspers, right? That's all Otherworld stuff. And so that's why this is kind of cool, because Tony Stark continues on and he says, I'm with Luke Cage as he and his Ultimate Avengers, an army of superpowered former prisoners, sweep through the South like a liberating fire. Regular citizens flock to join from all over, each with their own reasons, but all with something or someone to avenge. Now, the Luke Cage aspect, I don't think we've actually covered over the course of the Ultimate Universe run. For the most part, I think it was like 1 or 2 issues. It was not a great, big, huge, expansive story arc, but it was still pretty cool. It's exactly what it sounds like, right? That like a bunch of superheroes are basically being held prisoner. Luke Cage essentially freed them, and now he leads them. So the reality, if we're really calling it for what it is, it's essentially the Mighty Avengers within the Ultimate Universe. If you're familiar with the Mighty Avengers team, especially when Al Ewing was writing it, and it was led by Luke Cage. But again, that's where Tony continues on and says, defections are common among the enemy rank and file. 18 North American Union bases have been captured and converted to the cause. Now, that's the other part of this, and it's one of the other things that makes the story so great, is because I think oftentimes when people think of the idea of like a revolution against the government, right? People are just like, oh, that would never work because all the soldiers would fire nukes and they would kill us all. But people fail to forget, right, that when it comes to these kind of conflicts, you're talking about father versus son, mother versus daughter, brother versus sister, sister versus brother, aunts versus uncles. And family ties oftentimes are far stronger than any oath or loyalty taken to like a constitution. And so when you're talking about some massive uprising against the quote unquote powers that be, it's not as clear cut as like regular citizens with like handguns against soldiers with tanks, right? That what happens when you have generals who defect to the side of the people, when you have soldiers who defect. Sure, it may not necessarily be enough to turn the tide, or it might. Jericho is a really good example. If you guys ever saw the show Jericho, that's an example of what happens when you essentially have a civil war and it's not as clean cut as like the military versus citizens. But still, it's one of the things that kind of brings this back to the original Ultimate Universe story, right? Grounded in reality. And so that's where Tony continues on and he says, I'm in Martha's Vineyard, breaking the neck of a gamma-enhanced guard dog, and I'm in Albuquerque tending to the wounded. I'm in Detroit watching for retaliatory strikes, and I'm in Galveston eliminating a hidden hand recruiting office. We have forces in heaven, hell, and everywhere in between. The uprising is bigger than you can imagine. There is no one to spare. We will have to be enough. Now, I want you to keep that statement in the back of your head, right? This whole kind of exposition that Tony's giving about all the places that he's in, because that's going to become incredibly important here in a second. And so at that point, the clock starts counting down. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, all the way to 0. The dome opens and then it snaps shut again. And that's what's kind of crazy. It's because the expectation was that it was all going to come down and just this massive force was going to invade. That's what we assumed, and that's what all the members of the Ultimates assumed. And that's a crazy thing, because in that moment, Tony Stark on the Triskelion, right, the satellite that orbits the world, just almost kind of like shuts down to a degree, right, in the sense that She-Hulk asked the question, what's going on down there? And Tony just says, the dome is down. I repeat, the Maker is out of his cage. And then he just says, I can't see anything. Now, all these versions of Tony Stark are all speaking at the same time, even though they're in different locations. And so that's where She-Hulk says, Tony, you must see this. That storm is breaking atmosphere. And that's where the statement's made, right? It's some kind of dust storm. But again, you kind of switch back to Peter and he's like, so did the dome just come back up? And that's where Tony Stark is like, no, right? I'm cut off from everybody. Like, I have had complete and total access cut. And that's where things go sideways. And it's a genius strategy. Because one of the things that's kind of been established here, with Tony Stark being in all these different places, he's the linchpin. He's the entire foundation by which the Ultimates program works. And that's the danger. When you build an entire movement on your shoulders, when you kick that person out from the bottom, the whole thing collapses. It's why the only real movements that succeed have multiple people involved, multiple foundations, so that if one head is cut off, not to use any crazy Hydra analogies here, but like the whole thing continues on. One person cannot carry it all. When that happens, if that one person is gone, the entire movement collapses. And that's what's happening here. Because at that point, with Tony Stark cut off, now everything's going sideways. There's no real defense systems involved. There's no unification, none of that. Everyone's literally flying blind. And so that's where, back on the Triskelion, you find out that it's not a storm, that it's hand helicarriers. The entire hand fleet. Now, for those of you guys who don't remember what the Hand fleet was, and this goes into one of the most screwed up parts of the current Ultimate Universe, the Hand is currently led by Nick Fury. The idea, and most of you guys are probably aware of this, but in case you don't, in the Elektra miniseries, back in the day, you ended up getting like the origin of the Hand, right? Kaganobu Yoshioka, and basically, Japanese people taking off to the mountains to practice martial arts outside of the ruling government, and so on and so forth. And then eventually they were corrupted by the Beast, right? And they ended up becoming the Hand as we know them, involving themselves in mysticism, resurrection, different things like that. That exact same thing happened here in Earth 6160. What's different about this is that there came a point when the Maker was making his move across the world and beginning to mess with time, that he had Nick Fury kill the Beast, the leader of the Hand, and then Nick Fury took control of the Hand. And so the Hand were essentially reworked. So by all standards of measurement, the Hand is basically S.H.I.E.L.D., but instead of protecting the world from any kind of threats that exist out there, it exists to neutralize any threats that would work against the Maker, right? Basically ensuring the Maker's agenda. So they're essentially secret police. And so the crazy tragic part about this is that Nick Fury's not really Nick Fury. He's a life model decoy. We ended up finding that out, that Nick Fury is always programmed with the idea that he's like some kind of a freedom fighter. And then ultimately he tries to like lead a rebellion against the council. He always fails, that kind of a thing. And so they just kind of toy with him every so often. Now, the actual function and purpose of Nick Fury is to ensure the Hand operate as a secret police in favor of whatever it is the Maker wants to do. And that's why the bridge is called the Beast, is that Nick Fury orders the destruction of the Triskelion, and it works. They fire on the whole space station and obliterate the thing. And so at that point, the Ultimates network is down. Now everyone's separated, everyone's scattered, and no movement can really survive in that capacity. Even during the Civil War, they at the very least had like people on horseback with like messages, right? Spy networks, different things like that. But when there's no method of communication between these various groups that exist out there, now they're all fighting on their own. So if one group is getting totally eradicated, there's no way to call for backup. There's no way to call for help. And it's only a matter of time before they get completely destroyed. And so that's when you switch back over to the city itself, right? And Spider-Man says, my spider sense is going haywire. Either I'm having a heart attack or we're in serious trouble. And that's where Dr. Doom just says the temporal dome, the Darwin bubble, must have been reactivated somehow. And Tony Stark kind of chimes in here and he says, the math's all different. What's with this fourth dimensional curve? He says, and it grew in 3 dimensions. Its radius expanded to encompass us or to capture anything that might have escaped in the millisecond that the field was down. And so what they're really just kind of talking about here is that it was intentionally opened and intentionally closed, and they are trapped here on purpose. Someone did this intentionally. And so America just says, right, why would the Maker do that? Right? He's been trapped for thousands of years. Why would he slam the door shut on his own cell? And that's where Doom says he would not, right? The only reason to do such a thing, and Tony cuts him off and he says, it would be to buy the outside world more time. My father, this has to be him. He's alive. And Doom just kind of says, unlikely, right? Howard Stark was a brilliant and resourceful man, but I doubt even he could survive for thousands of years inside of this city. Now, here's the other thing to understand, right? And it's the reason why they're talking about time in thousands of years instead of like 2 years, because what we know is that the current Ultimate Universe passes in real time. So 2 years ago to the day is when the Maker and the battle and everything was lost. And so why this matters so much is because of the fact that inside the city, time passes differently. And so while it's only been a couple of years on the outside world, it's been thousands of years inside the city. That's what made the imprisonment of the Maker so terrifying, is because you're basically talking about an evil version of Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four with thousands of years to do nothing but work on ways to kill people, right? Imagine the kinds of things that he could create, right? Just thousands of years and idle hands. But God only knows what would come out of this thing. And so that's what the question's asked. Is this the right place, right? I thought we were entering some kind of utopian city of tomorrow, but I guess tomorrow has seen better days because the place is completely screwed up. It's not utopian at all. It's not some kind of technological paradise. And even Dr. Doom says the air is soiled, filled with greasy particulate matter. And Tony says, nobody remove your masks, right? We don't know what we would be breathing in. For all we know, we could just take off our masks, we could take our first breath and immediately die, right? Like who knows what happens here? And so as they start making their way through, right, Tony Stark says, upload the payload and take control of the city before the Maker's forces find us. And he just says, right, Doom? Like that's what we want to do. And Doom seems kind of distracted and just says, yes, of course, right? The city is a living thing, always evolving. The architecture is nothing like it was. Still, we must go there, right, to the central spire. It is almost unrecognizable, but that is the center of the city's nervous system. And so that's what they all say, then let's go. And in that moment, they're ambushed by the children of tomorrow. Now, the children of tomorrow, as they were created by the Maker, are exactly what it sounds like, right? If the Maker had the ability to create sentient life and then evolve that sentient life over time. And so that's one of the crazy things here because they look bonkers. And for those of you guys who have been reading comics for a very, very long time, especially back in the 90s, right? If you were reading the comic book stories about like the far-flung future, when you have like Cable and Strife waging a war against each other, when you had Apocalypse in like the year 3000, that kind of dystopian future, this is very reminiscent of that, right? It's almost kind of like man-machine combination, right? Not in the sense of like cyborgs, but literally a melding of man and machine. And so with these children finding them, they are immensely overpowered. But the funny thing is that Tony Stark says that he had prepared for this, right? He says, don't worry, I've prepared a countermeasure for this. Antimatter machine guns. And he literally just like fires these antimatter energy bursts onto these guys and nothing happens, right? He's like, that's impossible. Nothing that exists can withstand an antimatter blast. It's quite literally antimatter, right? The opposite of existence. But that's where you kind of start to realize here that the Maker had been preparing for this for quite some time. And so as the fight goes on, these guys stand less and less of a chance, and they keep getting obliterated more and more. So much so that like Tony Stark just kind of looks around and it's like, I don't know what to do, right? Like literally every failsafe that I had for us to make our way through this place and to deal with whatever threats may befall us are failing, right? This guy is just that far ahead of us. But that's when out of nowhere, Death's Head and Deathlocks show up. Now, here's the thing about Death's Head. Death's Head is a really wonky character. Kind of sidetrack here for a second. Death's Head's a really wonky character. Death's Head, a lot of people think that he originally debuted in Transformers UK back in like 1987. Not really. There was a Marvel comic strip that he appeared in, and I can't remember exactly what it's called. It's like Texas something or other. The idea was that he was supposed to appear in a Transformers comic for the Marvel UK branch when Marvel was expanding out into other countries. The issue was that the nature of the copyright deal between Hasbro and Marvel was that any character who was created and appeared initially in a Transformers comic would become the property of Hasbro. So in order to make sure that didn't happen, Marvel published him in a comic strip from Marvel and then published him in Transformers so that Marvel would maintain ownership of it. He was kind of an on-again, off-again character. Right? Initially, he was like a throwaway character. He wasn't a great, big, huge deal. Marvel tried to bring him back a couple of times, more recently in 2009, I think, based on a fan poll. The only thing that you really need to know about Death's Head is that he doesn't change. He's not like, Dr. Octopus, where like he takes over the body of Peter Parker and then like realizes, oh my God, I should turn over a new leaf and become a good guy or anything like that. No. He just kills for money. The guy's a bounty hunter. That's it. That's all he's ever been. But he's one of these super obscure characters that for some reason that I will never fully understand has a very small but insanely dedicated fan base. It's nuts. We could probably make a video on him if you guys are interested. But he's important in relation to this because he actually shows up as a way to essentially rescue the Ultimates. And in fact, he says that, right? Language detected, American English, 21st century dialect. And he says, tourists, the city is not so friendly for tourists. And he says, more children are coming, but you are rare and therefore valuable and therefore worth saving. So move like citizens, not tourists. Hurry, follow Death's Head. And so what this establishes here is that where the Deathlocks have basically been activated, so they're essentially cannon fodder, this lays out the idea that the city is not just a place that's ruled with an iron fist by the Maker, that this place is actually engulfed in a civil war and seemingly has been for quite some time. And honestly, that's an amazing twist because again, I think the biggest thing that we all kind of expected is that the walls of the city would come down and the Maker had like created celestials or like giant sentinels or had an army of like 50,000 Wolverines or something like that, right? And like a million Deadpools or something. And they would all just come pouring out with their healing factors and their adamantium and their swords and just like attack everybody and kill everything. And the battle would be over like that. But the idea that like the entirety of the city is seemingly engaged in a civil war and has been for thousands of years completely changes the dynamic, which is kind of dope. Because again, like while they're basically being taken away, they're taken off to what's essentially a kind of base, right? It's not this great big huge Babel spire or anything like that. It's just almost like this kind of just technological hut that exists over there somewhere. But what does happen here is Death's Head tells them this one's designation is Death's Head 22, freelance freedom fighter for hire. You are this one's prisoner, bounty. And when they ask the question, right, like, why are we prisoners? We came here willingly. Death's Head tells him the commander will answer your questions or devolve you to single-celled organisms before you can ask them. One can never be sure which one he will do. And he says, either way, this one gets paid. And so that's where in the face of all of this, Tony Stark just says, it is my father, right? It has to be. All of this is clearly derived from Stain Stark Iron Man technology. And that's where Death's Head just says, this one knows nothing of Stark Stains or Iron Man. This one serves on an entirely at-will basis the commander. And that's where you meet him, right? Immortus, the Lord of Time. And this guy just says, Death's Head, is that you? I hope you've brought fresh corpses. I'm almost out of parts. And Tony looks at him and just asks, right, like, father? Because this is clearly Howard Stark, but Howard Stark doesn't know who he is, right? You know, like Tony says, like, it's me, right? Tony, your son. And he just says, the son is the father to the man. I've had so many fathers and so many sons. You bear my mark, but I do not remember making you, any of you. Perhaps I haven't made you yet, or perhaps it was so long ago that I have forgotten. Because that's the crazy thing about Immortus. When you're talking about like basically the end result of Kang the Conqueror to a degree, this obviously doesn't function the way it does in the main Marvel Universe, where Immortus is a future version of Kang, that the reality here is that with it being Howard, time manipulation seems to kind of go back and forth. And so it's him meeting his father, it's his father meeting him, it's him having sons. It's not linear, right? It's not you are a man and then you have a son and your son has a son and your son has a son, right? It just keeps going that way on down the line. When you're talking about time travel, it's anything but trustworthy. And so that's why he talks about the idea of the father is the son of the father, and I've had many fathers and I've had many sons. And for him, it's just one great big huge confusing mess. And so that's where Doom addresses him directly and says, Stark, Immortus, whatever you call yourself, we have come to end the Maker. We have brought weapons, viruses, and poisons that we think can do the job. Can you help us find him? And that's where Howard just starts laughing, right? And it says, I see I made you with a sense of humor. Delightful. And he says, it's not finding the Maker, my forgotten son. It's escaping him. And the reason why is because he says, the Maker is the city. He's literally merged with it. So to fight the city is to fight the Maker himself. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.